Hello guys, today we are going to be talking about asynchronous programming in JavaScript. JavaScript is usually referred to as a single-threaded language. What this simply means is that JavaScript cannot do multiple things at a particular point in time. It can only do one thing at a time. Hence, when JavaScript wants to execute functions, it executes one after the other, unlike some other languages like Java that is multi-threaded. To narrate this, we are going to be taking an example. So I'm going to open up my editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code. You can use any editor you like. I've created a file already, async.js, so you can do the same. Now, we're going to console log starting. Now I'm using Node.js, so you can also install Node.js by searching on Google Node.js installation. It's pretty easy to install. So after to simulate an asynchronous process, we're going to be using something called Settimeout, a call to Settimeout, which accepts a function as the first argument. And as a second argument, it's going to accept time. That is how long it should take before this function is going to be called. So first I'm going to pass in 0 seconds, 0 milliseconds. I'm going to console log after 0 seconds. Now after that, I'm going to console log again, middle of the code. Then we're going to call set timeout again. Now this is going to accept a function and it's going to accept how long before this function is going to be called. Now I'm going to pass 3000 because set timeout accepts the time in milliseconds. So 3000 milliseconds is equals to 3 seconds. So console log after 3 seconds. Then finally, we're going to console log immediately. Now to run this, we're going to simply run node async.js and we're waiting for 3 seconds. Now first thing that happens is console log starting, which we see here starting. Nothing surprising here. Now we made a call to set timeout, which console logs after 0 seconds after 0 seconds. Now instead of seeing after 0 seconds in the console, we see middle of the code. It's as if it jumped the execution of this code. Then we will go ahead and call set timeout after 3 seconds. One would expect the code to pause at this point for these 3 seconds to reach, but it doesn't. Rather, it goes to the next and console logs immediately before we now see the 0 seconds and 3 seconds. So in this video, this is what we're going to try to explain. So in order to understand asynchronous programming, there is something very important we need to understand first, and that's the call stack. The call stack is a mechanism that helps the JavaScript interpreter to keep track of the function that the script calls. So each time a script is called, the call stack takes, each time a function is called rather, the call stack takes note of those functions. And every time a function calls another function, so let's say we have another function inside that function, it is added to the top of the task on the calling function that is in the call stack. To explain this further, we're going to take a look at an example. This example is a simple add function that accepts two arguments, two numbers, and it console logs the result of the two numbers, the result of the addition of the two numbers. Now on the right, you can see the call stack. Now in the call stack, you can already see a call to a function called main. Now in Node.js, before the execution of any function at all, the main function is going to be called first. Now, after the main function has been called, we now see the call to add. Now, the function begins to execute, and then it sees console.log, and then it console logs the result. You can see that in the console. Alright guys, what we have here is another example. We have an array which has a list of subjects in the array. Then we have a for each that looks through the array 1 and calls an anonymous function for each of the items in the array. Now, as expected, the main is initialized first on the call stack. Then we have the for each that is going to be called. Now, inside the for each, we have an anonymous function, which is this, and then it is also called. And then we have a console log physics, that is the item, the first item in the array, which is logged in the console. Now, as soon as this is done, it pops out the console log from the call stack, pops out the anonymous function since it's done with it from the call stack. And then, but now it's not going to remove the for each from the call stack because it's not done yet. We have other items in the array. So it calls the anonymous function one more time, but this time with the English as an argument as the item. It calls console log, and we have English in the console. Then it pops out the log. Now pops out the anonymous function. And then it's still not done with the for each because we still have one item left in the array. So it calls the anonymous function one more time with the last item in the array. And then it calls console log on the item, and we see that on the console. And then once this is done, pops out the log from the call stack, pops out anonymous from the call stack, and now it's done with the for each loop, and then it can safely pop it out from the call stack, and then we are left with the main. And so since the function is done executing, it pops out the main function. Now back to the example we gave earlier. As soon as this code begins execution, we have main on the call stack as expected. Then it gets to the first line console log starting, and we have it on the call stack, and we have started in the console. Now we go further, we get to set timeout. Now what set timeout does is to execute a function after a particular period of time. Now, if you go through the JavaScript documentation, there is no such thing as set timeout there. Rather, it is present on the Node.js API, and then the Node API detects the set timeout, and then it is passed onto it for execution. Now the Node API waits for 0 seconds, and immediately after 0 seconds, it's then passed this function, being this callback function, into the callback queue. Now the callback queue, what the callback queue does is to keep track of functions that are ready to be called, that have been executed successfully by the Node API. Then we go further, we have console log, middle of the code, and then it's logged in the console. One would expect this callback to be called immediately it is in the callback queue, but then that is what this event loop is here for. The event loop takes a look at two things: the callback queue and the call stack. It looks at the callback queue and checks if there is any function present to be executed, and then looks at the call stack and ensures this call stack is empty before any other function is passed into the call stack. That's what the event loop does, and that is why we see middle of the code before the after 0 seconds in the set timeout, because the event loop must ensure the call stack is empty before any other thing is passed into it from the callback queue. Now we go further, we have set timeout again, and then we have after 3 seconds, and then this is passed into the Node API, and then it waits for 3 seconds before it sends the function into the callback queue for execution. Meanwhile, the code goes further. This is why JavaScript is referred to as non-blocking. It doesn't wait for the for requests to be completed before going further in the thread. Then we have console log immediately, and then it logs immediately in the console. Now it goes further, it unmounts the immediately, and then the main is empty. Now the event loop can see, okay, the call stack is empty, and then it starts sending functions that are ready to be called into the call stack. Then we go further, the first callback function is sent into the call stack, and then we see after 0 seconds. Now it goes further again and says, okay, after 3 seconds, this function is ready to be executed. This function is ready to be executed also, but then the call stack is not empty, so it unmounts the console log and the callback. Then it goes further and then says, okay, callback is the call stack is now empty. We can go further and sends callback to the call stack, and we see console log after 3 seconds in the console. And that's the end of this little presentation. But then there's another thing that usually confuses people: the difference between the call stack and the callback queue. Now the call stack works by first in, last out. That's the first function in is the last function out. That's why when we came here in the first example we gave, the first function in is main and is the last function to leave the call stack, whilst in the event loop It's first in, first out. As the function comes in, it's then passed to the call stack. That's the difference between the call stack and the event loop. Alright guys, hopefully this video made it easier for you guys. I know it's a little bit difficult to grasp at first, but with time you get the hang of it. Um, Before going, and there's one more thing. The reason JavaScript is referred to as node, I think I mentioned it earlier, is that when you have an asynchronous code that, for example, the set timer that is passed to the node API, if you notice, the timeout counting does not block the thread of the call stack. It doesn't stop anything from happening in normal call stack. It simply passes the asynchronous code into the node API, and whenever the request is completed, whether the set timeout or request to a database is completed, then execute it. Doesn't wait for the call stack. It doesn't block the call stack from executing its code normally. So that's that, guys. Thanks for watching. If you have any question, please leave it in the comment box, and then please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.